Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and hello to all participants around the world, and thank you for joining our Hopsteiner webinar series, Hoppy Topics. My name is Sandro, and I'm part of the technical support team here at Hopsteiner, Germany. The Hopsteiner webinar series is a free online seminar with presentations about hop-related topics. During the current situation of COVID-19 and the limitations of traveling and meeting each other, we have decided to additionally offer this kind of online support. In this way, we would like to keep you informed about newest research outcome of new product developments, new variety developments, and the many more insights of hops' versatile contributions in beer production. Before I introduce our speaker of today's presentation, everybody should know that questions and comments are absolutely welcome. Your microphone and your camera remain switched off, but you can address your questions through the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. We will pick up the questions at the end of the presentation. The presentation itself will take about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session of 15 minutes, so about 1 hour in total. After the webinar, you have the chance to give us a short feedback by answering 2 questions if you like to do so. Here with us today, we have Frank Peifer, our technical director at Hopsteiner. Frank started his brewing career 35 years ago after receiving his degree as an engineer in brewing science and beverage technology. Prior to his career at Hopsteiner, Frank worked at the Bayerische Staatsbrauerei Weinstefan as director of operations. In 2015, Frank joined our Hopsteiner team as technical director. He provides technical support for many breweries and brewing groups around the globe. He supports R&D activities for new product developments and technical applications. Besides, he's also responsible for the processing and packaging plants with competence as a technical advisor of optimizing processes and technologies. For more than 20 years, he has been working on exams of master brewers at the AHK in Munich. I guess there's nothing more to say, Frank, and I give the words to you now.
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Sandro. Good morning, everybody. Please welcome here for our first webinar from our webinar speaker series. And my topic today now it comes. I want to talk about the studies that we did on this new stylish beer that comes from northeast coast of the United States of America called New England IPA. And we did a lot of them, of these studies, and also our colleagues Jean-Paul May and Robert Smith in our division in the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about the outcome that we got, especially regarding the results coming by high hop dosages in dry hopping and how they influence the main quality parameters in this beer style. So at the beginning, I want to give you some basic recipe information. What makes this kind of beer, this New England IPA? It's not a total recipe, but it's just to bring you on the direction how it works. And then we talk about the very interesting analytical results that we got from the series that we produced in our Hopsteiner brewery here in Mainburg. These beers were at our booth in the fair in Nuremberg 2 years ago, and we found some very interesting parameters and results that are worth to discuss with you. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about the investigation results that we got from 12 commercial New England IPAs in the USA that was done by my colleague Jean-Paul May. To come to the basic information data, it looks like a regular IPA, this New England style IPA. We see the original gravity is something between 14 and 17 degrees Plato. That leads into medium fermentation, so you find between 2 and 4 degrees Plato remaining gravity. The IBUs are, yes, very typical for these beer styles. Some are lower, some are higher, something between 50 and 108 as we found. And the alcohol is also typical for this style of beer for an IPA, between 6 and 8%. The color needs to be very light. That means we have a light color beer and a lot of haze. We want haze, haze, haze. In combination with this light color, we have a more juicy and fruity appearance. And some of these beers, they really look like orange juice. Talking about the ingredients, yes, we can pimp up our water a little bit with calcium chloride and calcium sulfate to improve or increase the mouthful and softness and also the hoppy character of the beer. But especially with the chlorides, be careful. That is a very high value, I think. And we know that the very high chloride concentration can lead into corrosion on our stainless steel equipment. So the malt or the grist bill, first of all, we use light color malt like Pilsner malt, and then we need a protein source because we want to produce very high and stable haze in our beer. And for this, we need proteins coming, for example, from flayed oats or especially here from wheat or from wheat malt. In our trials, we used wheat malt. Around 30% of the grist bill was coming from wheat, and they tend to a very good and very stable haze. So these prolamines, they are the proteins we need to create such a high haze and a good and stable haze. But the stability of haze we will discuss later on. And we come to the hops. We really have to be focused on the fruity and citrus varieties that we find on the market, especially with the linalool and geraniol concentration that is also very high, because this linalool and geraniol rich varieties, they tend to provide this very nice and very intensive fruitiness and citrusy flavor on the beer. Our yeast that we use don't need to be that high in attenuation. It's better when the attenuation is medium, because we still have to create a typical body and sweetness in the beer, because that is the basis of the complete aroma of the whole creation of the beer style. It's not bad if we have a high ester performance, if we have also medium or low flocculation tendency coming from this yeast, because the more longer the yeast stays in the liquid, has a good and intensive contact with the hop aroma compounds, the more you will find later on special hop aroma compounds like terpene alcohols. So regarding the hopping, what we have to avoid is a high level of iso-alpha acids. To create this type of beer, the bitterness is not in focus. It's just the aroma impression and the color and the haze. So it's enough when you have a very small addition to the boil to avoid overforming, and that is all that you need. And all the other hop additions, they come later. Then we start in the whirlpool. If it's possible to reduce the temperature in the whirlpool, let me say to temperature between 80 and 85 degrees centigrade, please don't go below the 80 degrees centigrade because of the microbiological conditions that we have. Then you don't have any isomerization, and then you bring all these aroma compounds, or the main amount of the aroma compounds, into the whirlpool, into the brew, into the wort, and you can transform it easily later on into fermentation maturation without any high grade of evaporation, because the whirlpool temperature is reduced to a lower temperature. It can be between 30 and 50% of the whole amount of hops that you add. It depends on your own recipe. But you see here, now we are talking about very high hop loads. We did it with around 1 kilogram in the whirlpool, and then we had another 3 hop additions in dry hopping. Was the beginning of fermentation, was to maturation and to the stored beers. And each of these additions were around 1 kilogram. We found additions between 3 and 5 kilogram per hectoliter in the literature, but it goes together with high losses in beer. The more hops you add into your system. We also have to know that with the help of our enzymes coming from the yeast, we can have a very high impact on the so-called biotransformation to enforce the formation of terpene alcohols. What does this mean? We have hop-based terpene alcohols in a free form, like free geraniol, and we also have geraniol precursors. That means that geraniol is bounded to a glycoside or to an acetate or an acetatic form, and it's not in a free form, and it has no contribution to the aroma. The yeast that we add normally starts with an enzymatical release. It's releasing the beta-glucosidase at the beginning of fermentation, and this beta-glucosidase is able to split geraniol from the precursor form, and then geraniol is set free, and that goes on all over the process when yeast is involved, and especially when the enzymes are active, and that leads into a pathway from geraniol to citronellol and to terpineol. So these compounds are increased over the time fermentation maturation as long as the yeast enzymes are active. And the effect that we get out of this is that we are able to enforce the citrusy, lime-like aroma character in those beers. And that goes very well. We tested it several times. That is something that is always happening when you have a hop addition to, let me say, fermentation or maturation, when the yeast is active and when we have a certain enzymatical activity in our beer. Now let's come to the Hopsteiner NEIPAs we produced in our brewery. You see here that is the typical appearance. Don't look on the foam stability. We will discuss it later. That is the color, and that is the haze that we got from these trials, and it really looks like orange juice. The first analytical results we got regarding the IBUs and the bitter compounds showed us there's a very wide discrepancy in between the IBU level and between the iso-alpha acids. And we also found alpha acids, and we also found so-called humulinones in our bitter compound composition. Then we asked the people at the fair in Nuremberg, 299 tasters were asked to give their estimated bitterness regarding the tasted bitterness. And that is what they mentioned. You see here, we made two trials. One was done with the 3 kilogram dry hopping of Sultana, and one beer was produced with 3 kilogram dry hopping of Lotus. And you see here's a big difference in between the estimated bitter units coming from the tasters and the analytical bitter units coming from our laboratory. And it's almost double what we found in the analytics compared to the bitterness people estimated by tasting. And that's something that differs a lot, and we were asked to go a little bit deeper inside this phenomenon. So what we already know, these are the alpha acids coming from the hops, and in the boil under a certain temperature and pH conditions and time, we have a transfer of into more or less iso-alpha acids. On the other hand, it's also possible that before hops are processed, before they come into a container or package where there's no oxygen anymore, then the oxygen from the air leads to form these so-called humulinones. So they are transferred from the alpha acids by oxidation to humulinones. And yeah, we find humulinones in between 0.25 to 0.35% in the hops, and they also have an impact on the bitterness. So What is the impact on the bitterness of these compounds, especially when we have a focus on dry hop beers? So what we found out by tastings, that is something that you already know, that 1 ppm of iso-alpha acids have a sensory bitterness of 1 IBU. That's easy to understand. Compared to the alpha acids, they only have around 10% of the perceived bitterness compared to the iso-alpha acids. And when we have a look on the humulinones, it's about 2/3 of the bitterness of the iso-alpha acids. And then we have a mixture in our dry hop beers of these compounds. There are also other compounds, but these are the main compounds, and they contribute to the perceived bitterness, but in different ways. To calculate the perceived bitterness the right way, we see there's a formula. It's a similar formula now. It's also possible to make it a little bit more exact, but this is very easy to understand. That is the whole amount of the iso-alpha acids, and that is 2/3 of the amount of the humulinones, and that is only 10% of the amount of the alpha acids. And they all contribute, or they all bring a calculated bitterness. And now let's see how this calculated bitterness fits into our diagram. Now it's visible, and you see that the calculated bitterness is now much closer on the estimated bitter units. And for the Lotus beer, it's on the same level. You see here, it's still 5 bitter units in between, but now we are much closer on the real bitterness that the beers have. And that is especially what we see when we have dry hop beers, because they behave much different compared to standard beers that we know from the past. So I created this slide to show you how they behave, how certain bitter compounds, alpha acids, humulinones, and we have the reduced iso-alpha acids in form of Pro. We have the iso-alpha acids, and we have the reduced and hydrated iso-alpha acids in form of tetra. And now let's see what is the difference in between the perceived bitterness and in between the bitter units that we measure with our method in the laboratory. Everything is on a basis of 1 ppm of those hop bitter acids. Here we have seen the perceived bitterness for alpha acid is just 10% compared to 1, that is for the isos, we see later. And we measure in our laboratory with a method a value of around 0.6 to 0.63. So that's much more that we measure than we have in our mouth. Have a look on the humulinones, they are more or less even. Same level of perceived bitterness compared to the IBUs that we measure. Then we go to Rho. It's around 0.8 what we measure in the laboratory, and 0.7 what we perceive. For ISO, it's also 0.8, but it's one by one. That is what I explained before. And for Tetra, that's something special, a special product where we also have the result from the method coming with 0.8, but the perceived bitterness of the Tetra can be in between 1 and 1.3. So 1.3 times compared to the iso-alpha acids. We made some tests and we found out that especially for the beer and the beer matrix, something in between 1.0 and 1.1 is reasonable, and not 1.3. 1.3 you only find when the matrix where you add the tetra into is water. And then you have a higher influence coming from the tetra bitterness compared to the iso-alpha bitterness. So the method that we are using is measuring the bitter acids in an isooctane layer at a light frequency of 275 nanometers, and the absorption then is multiplied with a factor and gives the IBUs. What we found out is now that the test, the IBU values that come out of the method of the IBU test can be completely different from the sensory bitterness. That was proven by the tasting. And when we have a closer look onto the method of the analysis, that is the EBC 9.8, we see that is a calculation, that is the absorbance at 275 nanometers, and then we have a factor for multiplication, and that is 50. That was once set to 50 decades before. It was decided to use a 50 because that was really fitting the perceived bitterness in beers produced with hop pellets, standard beers, not talking about dry hopping beers. So what we have now is with some beers a problem that the IBU is completely matching or is good matching with the perceived bitterness. To give you one example, imagine you have a beer that is hopped just with 20 ppm of iso-alpha acids, no other bitter compounds inside. So the 20 ppm of the iso-alpha acids, when you measure this with a method, you will find out that it leads into 16 bitter units. But the perceived bitterness, we know iso-alpha acids behave one by one. Perceived bitterness is 20. So there's a big gap in between the 16 coming from the method and the 20 perceived bitter units coming from the tasting. And that needs to be evaluated, especially when you produce beers with other products than hop pellets, hop cones and extracts, or when you have production of dry hop beers. And that means that the factor needs to be assessed internally. Then it's not 50 anymore. And going back to the example I told you before, the 20 ppm of ISO, then we are talking about a factor that is around 62.5. And then you come to the same result that is matching the perceived bitterness with the IBUs. So then we found something very interesting, and we got this effect, or we were informed about this effect by customers years ago, and we were very surprised that we had, let me say, a second fermentation or after fermentation in the bottle, and that can tend also to explosion or to something that looks like gushing when you open the bottle. And by this test that we did with the NEIPAs, with our high hop additions, again 3 kilograms per hectoliter on dry hopping, we found very interesting results. Beginning here with the reference beer, and out of the reference beer we took 1/3 to make dry hopping beer Jugend IPA with Sultana, and 1/3 to produce a dry hop beer with the US Lotus. So the base beer was completely the same. We had the same addition into the whirlpool, so there was no difference. And for the base beer or the reference beer, there was no dry hopping, but the yeast that we used was also the same for all these 3 trials. And they were done at the same time, coming out of the same brew. Have a look here, please, on the original wort. We see after dry hopping, we have an increase of the original wort. We also have an increase in alcohol. We have a reduced residual extract in the beer, and we have a little bit higher final attenuation. I come later with the next slide to this, but also have a look on the pH, how the pH behaves when you have high hop addition. The pH is going up, and that's a massive increase of pH. It's not talking about 1/10, it's around 5/10 of the pH, and that's a lot. And also the foam stability was looking very different after dry hopping, but that is something I will also discuss when I come to the end of my presentation. Now we use this information, this data, and put it on the next slide to show the delta, the deviation from the reference beer regarding the 2 beers dry hopped with 3 kilograms each. And here we see the effect that I have additional extract input, and that must come from hops because there was no other extract added to the beer behind the brew house. And we also have a very high increase of alcohol. That's something that is blowing up your labeling on your bottle when you don't know the effect before you produce the labels. It also means when you calculate back with the Balling formula, you find that a very high corresponding amount of CO2 is formed by this additional, let me say, additional fermentation process, and that needs to be also keep into consideration that you have CO2 produced, and if you produce this CO2 in the bottle, then you have problems. Then the real extract, the remaining extract, is down by more than 1.3% for both beers. That also sees or goes into directions that some enzymes are working, and these enzymes must come from the hops, because without the hops we don't have the effect. And these enzymes from the hops, they are able to split remaining starch or remaining sugar compounds into fermentable sugar. And at the end of the day, we had a little bit higher final attenuation on this beer. That is what people call the hop creep effect. So for the hop creep effect, we need an enzymatic activity, and this enzymatic activity comes directly from the hops. We need an active yeast, because without active yeast we don't have this fermentation effect, and that is the biggest problem, the active yeast. You can imagine if I have yeast inside and I do the dry hopping on a very low temperature. This was done at around 90 to 20 degrees centigrade, and then you have a certain effect with the yeast that starts again with fermentation. But when you do it at 4 or at 0 degrees centigrade, your yeast is inside, it's not active, you have no fermentation, and then later on you transfer the yeast cells into your bottle, and then the fermentation starts again, but then it's too late. Then the yeast is activated again, you have fermentation, you have the formation of alcohol and the corresponding volume of CO2, and that is a big problem. So we have seen that fermentable sugars come from a release of malt dextrins. It's not fermentable behind the brew house, but now fermentable by the impact from the enzymes. And we must have fermentable sugars introduced by dry hopping coming from the hops. Otherwise, when you do the calculation, you find out that there must be coming more fermentable sugar into the game, because finally we have this increase of the original wort by around 0.6 to 0.8%. A very short look on the analytical results from the aroma compounds that we found in these beers. My colleague Martin Bindel will talk about this effect and the story behind this in the webinar in 2 weeks. It's on June 18. But you see, for example, very high values. We normally don't find these values. That goes up. The myrcene concentration in the Sultana beer went up to nearly 1 milligram per liter. In the old days, we were talking about micrograms, about 500 maximum, and now we have nearly 10,000 microgram per liter. So a lot of impact coming from the mass of hops in dry hopping on these beers. But you see that it's different. It's not always on the same value. So both varieties, they behave different. They are sisters. They come from the same breeding line, but they behave different, especially here regarding the impact from certain aroma compounds. At the fair in Nuremberg, we also asked the people about the preference they have on these 2 beers, and it was not that clear, but it was more clearer that the Sultana beer had the highest preference. But I don't want to calculate it back to higher aroma compound values that we found inside, because that's always something special. And some aroma compounds we cannot measure these days, and they also have a very high impact on the aroma impression of a hop variety. Now we go to the results coming from the investigation from my colleague Dr. Jean-Paul May on these 12 commercial England IPAs, all produced in the United States of America. He had a look especially on the haze and on the haze stability versus time. We all know that is a problem to produce beers with a high constant haze or turbidity over the timeline, over the shelf life, because all particles tend to sediment. They go down to the to the ground, to the bottom of your container, of if it is a bottle, if it is a can or a keg, that doesn't matter. That is physics, because they have a certain weight and they sink down. The more smaller the particles are, the more longer they stay stable in the beer. But especially at lower temperatures, here he used 3 degrees. That's something you find on shelf in refrigerators where the beers are in. You see, after 4 weeks, after a month, even the beer with the highest turbidity at the beginning, and that's very good value, 160, that's very cloudy, it went down to around 50 EBC. 50, for me, 50 EBC turbidity, that is the borderline in between total haze and coming clearer. So this is what you can see visually as well. And all the other beers with lower starting turbidities are below these values. And here we only had a little bit more than 20 at the beginning, and after 1 month the beer was completely clear. So the tendency is clear, and to keep a good stable haze and a good stability of haze during the shelf life in the supermarket, that is a big challenge for these brewers. Our colleague was also looking for the compounds who makes the haze. What's responsible to build up a haze or the turbidity in these beers? And then he measured the turbidity and also the yeast count to be sure to exclude that the yeast contributes to the turbidity, because it doesn't. We all know that 1 million yeast cells per milliliter contribute to around, let me say, 2.1 EBC of haze. That's not much. And there was just one beer with a higher concentration of yeast cells, was beer number J, with 5 million cells per milliliter. And when you calculate this with 2.1, then you come that only for this extreme high yeast concentration, it was only 45% of the yeast contribution to this very low haze of 24 EBC. So yeast normally doesn't play a role regarding the turbidity of a beer. And it makes no sense to find a way to stabilize the yeast in a beer for a longer time, because it doesn't work. Yeast settles down very fast. That is what we know, and that is what we use this effect when we make our beers. Then this next idea was to have a deeper look into the haze material. So he used a centrifuge, a beer number 1 and a beer number 2, excuse me, was before centrifugation, and here after centrifugation. Same for beer number 2. What he found is that the centrifugation has a very high impact on the turbidity, from 160 to 40, and here from 227 down to 114. So that's a lot. There's a big difference coming from this physical gravity effect of centrifugation. We also found out that the centrifugation doesn't have a really big impact on the concentration of humulinones and isoalpha acids in this beer before and afterwards. And you see there's not a big difference in between the beers regarding these two compounds, because they are solved very well in the liquid. And so it's normally relatively impossible to bring them out by centrifugation. But the other guys, here in yellow, the nonpolar hop compounds, the alpha acids are very nonpolar. They tend to settle down or to leave the beer. So also myrcene is very nonpolar, xanthomol and the beta acids, and they show different behavior, because here you have very high losses. Have a look on the myrcene. More than 50% of the myrcene in this beer, a little bit less than 50% in beer number 2, they disappeared together with the haze material. And also for the beta acids, and the value of beta acids around 14 ppm is hard to find in regular beers, because beta acids are completely insoluble, especially on this temperature level and this pH level, and normally they disappear after wort cooling and after the fermentation process and the pH drop begin. So the next step was to categorize the freezed and dried haze material. And what our colleague found out, okay, there's a lot of hop compounds in this hazy material. Altogether, 12% of the haze material were coming directly from the hops, and most of them from the hop addition in dry hopping. He also found typical proteins and polyphenols because they behave as haze formation compounds, and also found some starch because some beers were produced with oat flakes addition at the end of the process, and that was not transferred anymore into fermentable extract. What he also found, and that's very interesting, relatively high amount of fatty acids here in yellow, and it's nearly 1% of the substances are fatty acids, and that is C18 molecules. And these C18 molecules, they have a very bad behavior on the foam stability of our beers. But I cannot say from my point of view of today what is the source of these fatty acids, where they come from. Do they come from hop addition, from dry hopping, or do they come from microorganisms like yeast cells? We don't know. That is something that is still under investigation, and let's have a look what happens there in the future. That there must be an impact from dry hopping on the foam stability. We have seen here in the results from our New England IPA trials. You see the difference between the reference beer, especially Sultana, that is very big, with 78 foam value of 78 is very poor, and also 98 is not the best. And we put everything that we got from the last research and development activities here on this slide, and here you can see how the foam stability behaves. That is regarding Steinfurt by increasing additions of dry hopping from 0 up to 3 kilograms per hectoliter. Something was measured here on IPAs, and these are the results from the New England IPAs. And you see that the behavior looks like the same. The more hops you add, the more worse the foam stability goes. But we still are searching for the reasons for these phenomena. Okay, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope there are a lot of questions coming up now by my colleague Sandro.
Hello, Frank. Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Yes, indeed, we had a couple of comments and also some questions here. I pick up the first one, which was about the additional hop components that are found especially in those kinds of beers, like the humulinones, the alpha acids, the beta acids in very high concentrations. You mentioned everything about analytical issues and the perceived bitter intensity, but do you know also something about the bitter quality of those components and the individual direction they go if you taste them in such high amounts?
Yes, that is something that you can follow up very easily. Order these compounds or try to get these compounds. I think it's easy for iso alpha acids and for alpha acids, but not so easy for humulinones. But you see how they behave, how the bitterness, the perceived bitterness is. And for the iso alpha acids in the concentrated form, we know that it's coming very fast, goes very high summit, and then it goes down very fast again. And all other bitter compounds, they behave a little bit different, that it comes a little bit slower, and then the summit is lower, and then it goes down a little bit slower, so that you have the impact of the bitterness in your mouth for a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you very much.
But that, I cannot talk about all bitter compounds, because that's also hard to achieve, to get this concentrated, clean bitter compounds in this form.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the NEIPA is a very complex matrix, and it's difficult to say something about individual components. Sure.
Yes, and it's just for the NEIPAs. For this example, it's just a model to create a bitterness that goes more to the perceived bitterness.
Yeah. Okay. Then you mentioned something about the pH that is getting higher after dry hopping. Do you have any idea how to keep the pH in a reasonable range regarding microbiological issues, regarding flavor stability? So is there any technique to avoid the increase or to keep it as low as possible?
The problem is that we are still looking to find the reason for the increase in pH. That is increasing with dry hopping. That is, yeah, that's very common, but we don't know the reason. Is it what I think? Maybe that could be one reason when the yeast cells die and tend to autolyzation. I know that the pH is increasing. I did some tests at the university, but then we were talking about 0.2 of pH and not about 5 or 6/10. So we're still looking to find the reason. What you can do is a let me say an acidification with technical acid to reduce the pH, to bring it or to balance it on a certain level that you like. But be careful when you drop down the pH with any acids later on after dry hopping in the finished beer, you will also find out that the beer flavor behaves different than before. And what I know from wheat beers, we always produce wheat beers on higher pHs with very good results. And when we drop down the pHs, technical wise, we found out that the flavor was not the same anymore, because I think that the flavor impact on your palate is also influenced by the pH of the liquid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. There was also a question about the fatty acids that come in, they make the foam reduce a lot and so on. And do you think that they are of interest regarding aging of the beer, especially in case of an NEIPA, which is very intense in flavor? So is there a real impact on this?
To get back and to answer the first, that is something that we have not proven. That is just what came out by the test, that we found around 1% of fatty acids in these beers, but we have no link to the foam behavior. We know that the foam is also decreasing by higher additions in dry hopping, but we don't have the link in between the fatty acids and the bad foam quality, because on the other side, by dry hopping, you also add foam positive compounds to the beer, especially alpha acids, for example.
Okay.
So that is something that we have to follow up, and also the behavior of these fatty acids we have to follow up. If they are to find in the haze compounds, then the next question is it better to remove these hazy compounds, because together with the hazy compounds are also able to remove a lot of these fatty acids as well. So, but that's something that's a job for the future.
Okay. Another question that came in is about the shelf life of a pasteurized beer in the bottle. Do you think there's a huge difference between pasteurization of those beers? Yes and no.
There is a difference in pasteurization or by pasteurization. Those beers, we have clear results coming from bottle pasteurization. I have first results coming from short-time heating devices. They go into the same direction. So something is happening there with certain aroma compounds, not with all the aroma compounds, but something is going on. If these are losses or the structures of some aroma compounds are changing, we don't know. But there is a very high impact coming from any kind of pasteurization, even if it is in the bottle or in the can, or it's flash pasteurization.
Okay. Then we have another one here. What do you think about the increase in the pH? Does it influences the fermentation processes and the yeast activity and vitality?
Oh, that is what we have to ask Dr. Hutzler in Weichstefer. It's very special. I don't know.
Okay. Just a second. then there's again the question more concrete about the sensory evaluation of the bitterness and the analytical evaluation. Maybe you can slip back to the slide to give again this information where you have the three bitterness inside.
This one.
Yes, and I guess the next one as well, where you see the BU versus sensory. So maybe you can explain again how much each one contributes and what comes out in the end on the analytical and on the sensory side.
Yes, I will try it again. I have enough time, no problem. Okay. When we have normal beer production, everything starts with the addition of alpha acids into the brew, into the wort. And by high temperature, by certain pH and certain time, we have more or less isomerization of the alpha acids into iso-alpha acids. On the other side, we have an oxidation of alpha acids into so-called humulinones. But that happens before the hops are processed. In situations on the field and in storage when oxidation has an impact on hop bitter compounds, then it's possible that these humulinones are produced out of alpha acids by oxidation. We think it a little bit depends on the time. It depends also on the variety. But yes, let me say average value is around 0.3%. It's not that dominant in our original beer processing, because when we make a normal beer or an old style beer or regular beer in the brew house, the hop addition is relatively low to what we have seen here in dry hopping on this New England IPAs. And then especially when you add 3 kilograms per hectoliter, then you have also a high addition of humulinones, and they have a good solubility. They go very well into solution, and they have also then an impact with their certain concentration on the beer bitterness. And what is that's something that was found out, that the perceived bitterness of 1 ppm iso-alpha acids is exactly 1 IBU. Alpha acids is only 10% of the iso-alpha acids, and the humulinone behaves with a perceived bitterness of around 2/3 of the iso-alpha acids. And when you bring this together into a very simple formula, then you have a tool that to calculate the bitterness of a dry hop beer. I have to repeat it, of a dry hop beer with this simple formula, and then you come to the result that the calculated bitterness, here's the right bar, goes much closer into or direction to the estimated bitterness from the tasters. It's not the real value, it's not the same value, it's not 100% result, but that is a tool that helps to come a little bit closer to what people taste compared to the IBUs measured in the laboratory.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Frank. Another question came up about the hop creep effect and that it can cause gushing in the end. Do you think it's only due to the additional carbonation, or are there maybe also other components or coming in or effects that can cause the gushing finally? What do you think?
Yes, we once produced beers with 12 gram CO2 per liter. That's a lot. High carbonated beers for filter, and we had no gushing when the beer bottle was open cold. But when you have gushing activity or active compounds inside, and when you don't filter the beer, you have particles inside. Some smooth particles, some very sharp particles, and then they can act like condensation points for gushing, that the CO2 starts bubbling off there when you open the bottle. That's possible, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But the tendency and the risk of gushing is increasing with the CO2 concentration. That is general.
Okay. There was another analytical question now coming up. What do you think the high amount of haze and turbidity in those beers, do they affect the IBU analytics, or is it independent from the haze material?
That's a good question. When do you measure? Do you measure the bitter compounds in the haze together with the clear beer on top, or do you make it separately? Then you have different results. That's clear. Especially regarding the alpha acids, because they were very high present in the hazy material.
Yeah. I guess Martin will pick up this topic as well next in 2 weeks when he will talk a little bit more about the sensory about those beers, and I guess there's a possibility to divide it into the 2 fractions that you already mentioned. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Some more questions come in about the hop creep impact. Just try to pick up some of them together, which is is there something that where the yeast can react differently on varieties and on dry hopping conditions, or is it something that can be calculated in a rough way, always in the same rough way, let's say per quantity of hops that you add?
No. Oh, that is something that we don't know until now, because we don't know, let me say, the hop creep impact coming from a certain variety with a certain addition. That is something that's a good idea for a good job to do, that it leads into a list how high is the impact from this or that variety, but we don't have no general information on this today.
Okay. Another question about producing dry hop beers is how important is the cold stabilization at minus temperatures for dry hop beers? What do you think?
The cold stabilization, that means you use the same technology than you use for lager beers to stabilize the beer against haze by cold temperatures in storage tank.
Correct.
Yeah, that means looking on the technology of dry hopping, you have a very high impact from polyphenols, especially when you have hop loads like this. But in general, you have high impact on polyphenols, and even when you had a good physical stability before you do dry hopping, it's much different later on because of this impact coming from the polyphenols. So your balance that you had coming from the cold storage is completely unbalanced again, and then haze is formed. And that is my recommendation: when you make dry hopping, give the beer the time that the haze formation goes on and that you can remove the haze down to a value that you want to achieve. That is good for your beer style. And when you want to have a clear beer, you have to make this this process, and then later on you need something like centrifugation, very sharp, or filtration with a certain impact on the flavor compounds. Yeah.
Okay. One question came up about the dosing rate that you mentioned in your slides. I guess all of them were mentioned on the quantity basis, not on alpha basis, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, in general, dosing rates in the brew house, everything where it's hot, it's on alpha. Dosing late additions in the brew house, let me say in the whirlpool, is for us what we think is on linalool, and dosing hops at dry hopping is on total oil. That is what we are doing, how we calculate our dosages.
Okay, perfect. So I guess we picked up most of the questions, and as we come close to the hour, I would say thank you very much again, Frank, for this interesting presentation, and I hope everybody enjoyed the session with us today. After we close the webinar, you will receive an email including a link to review the recorded video from today's session, if you like to do so. And I would like to mention that the next webinar is in 2 weeks from our colleague Martin Bienl, and he will talk about the interesting New England IPAs and their typical composition of hop, bitter, and aroma compounds. We hope to see you there again, and until then, stay healthy and have a good time. Bye-bye, and thank you for joining.